I think we can probably get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this informational webinar that's related to the City of Lacey development process. My name is Sarah Schelling. I'm a senior planner with the City of Lacey Community and Economic Development Department. The purpose of this webinar tonight is twofold. The first purpose is to provide general information on the development process in the City of Lacey. So generally comprehensive planning considerations and regulations, local ordinance and zoning requirements, and land use review processes. The second purpose tonight is to give an update on two development projects that I think you're probably all aware of that are currently in the land use review process. We'll talk about what those two developments are proposing, where they are in the process, and what's going to happen next with those two developments. The purpose of the session is not to go into great detail about those two projects or really answer specific design-related questions, but generally give information about the process to which those projects are subject to. We don't want to go into too great of detail because the projects are still in early review. The process is still in early review, and technical staff's review has not been completed. No decisions have been made on those projects, and there are no recommendations to the hearings examiner or council at this point. They're still in the early stages of review, and public comment is still coming in on those projects. I do also want to mention that tonight, the purpose of tonight isn't to take public comment on those projects. There will be opportunity in the future at a public hearing to provide public comments on the record. There's also opportunity to provide written comment to the planners who are managing those projects. So speaking of those planners, in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Samara Seymour and Reese Fant, and they are the two other planners who manage current planning projects at the City of Lacey, and they're going to give an update on those projects, as well as, I'll turn things over to Samara first, who will discuss essentially Planning 101. In the presentation, we're going to have a question and answer session. Questions will need to be entered into the chat box on your screen. We're not doing live questions, except those that are entered on the chat box on your screen. And we'll address as many as we can in the time we've been allotted, about an hour and a half for this session. The webinar is being recorded and it's going to be made available on the City of Lacey YouTube channel. We can provide a link to all of you who've attended this session, and you can feel free to share it with your neighbors. And again, I just want to mention, although there will be some discussion of the Hicks Lake multifamily projects, we're not going to speak to specific project design related issues tonight. And that's because it's still early in the planning process. Anybody who's a party of record for those projects, though, will receive any notice of hearing once it's scheduled, and specific comments will be related to those projects can be addressed to the planners, and their information will be provided at the end of this session as well with the presentation. With all that being said, I'm going to now turn things over to Samara Seymour, who will get things started with the Planning 101 for us tonight. Samara?
All right, thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, there we are. I am Samara Seymour. I'm a senior planner here at the City of Lacey. I've been with the city now about 16 years. We do have the two other current planners, as she said, Sarah Schelling as our another senior planner, and then Reese Fant, who you'll hear from a little bit later, as our assistant planner. The three of us are basically your current planning staff here at the City of Lacey. We're responsible for reviewing all of the land use permits in the city. And so kind of why we're having this webinar tonight, based on the significant public interest, as well as some of the comments and questions that we've received in response to those two projects, staff thought it would be helpful to provide some information on both the planning process and the development process, in hopes that will provide folks with some greater context for how land use proposals are reviewed at the city. So we'll be, like I said, we'll be running through the planning and development process, what's involved in a project review, how are public comments used in the review process, and then Reese and I will speak briefly about the both Hicks Lake multifamily projects and where they're currently at in the process, and then we will finish up with some Q&A, as Sarah indicated. So in terms of the planning process, I thought we'd start out sort of at the 30,000 foot level, we call it, sort of with the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is a guiding document that presents the long-term vision for Lacey's future. The State Growth Management Act requires cities to update their comprehensive plan every 8 years. Lacey had a major update to its comprehensive plan back in 2016 with the Envision Lacey process. Some of you may very well have been involved in that process or participated in that. The comprehensive planning process runs through our planning commission. Planning commission itself holds lots of public meetings. However, the planning staff throughout that, I think it was like a year-long planning process or more, planning staff throughout that time went to numerous public events, street fairs, markets, those types of things. We held open houses and surveys to really try to get as much comment as we could from the public on their vision for our community and what they want it to look like. The comp plan is really like a policy roadmap that lays the framework for implementation of our land use goals. The planning commission, after we've the planning staff took all those comments and put it into this document. It has a final public hearing with the planning commission, who then makes a recommendation to our city council, and then the comp plan is ultimately adopted by the city council. A lot of times when we're in the planning department, we're talking about the comprehensive plan as the land use document, the land use element of the comprehensive plan. But really, the comprehensive plan is actually a number of documents, a number of plans that provide policy guidance for the city as a whole, not just on land use issues, but on things like housing and parks, open space, environmentally sensitive areas, our public services and utilities like water, sewer, stormwater. And then also we have a transportation plan that looks at the city's transportation goals as a whole, with like buses and cars, pedestrians, bikes, and streets as well. So there's a number of different elements the city includes in their comprehensive plan that then helps inform basically our implementation plans. So as you move down sort of the ladder from that 30,000 foot view at the comp plan, you get into more of the implementation documents. And the implementation documents are things like the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance is Title 16 of the Lacey Municipal Code, where you have the comprehensive plan talks about, like I said, goals and policies, kind of in some of that type of language, that broader type of language. The zoning ordinance sort of gets into the nitty-gritty of development standards. It looks at allowed uses, setbacks, landscaping, parking standards, sort of the physical nuts and bolts of development. The zoning ordinance is also established and revised via the Planning Commission process. Planning Commission, whenever a modification to our zoning ordinance is under consideration, it again goes to that Planning Commission process, who then make a recommendation to the council, and then the council will finally adopt that based on that approval. The zoning ordinance is where the three of us are the current planners for the city of Lacey, where we spend most of our time. We are responsible for reviewing land use applications for compliance with city regulations. Another element of the city's land use regulations is the Shoreline Master Program. And I'm bringing this up tonight, obviously, because we're talking about two development proposals that are adjacent to Hicks Lake. The city's Shoreline Master Program is developed and approved, again, via the Planning Commission and the City Council in the same legislative process that the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance are developed. The city developed its Shoreline Master Program in compliance with the State Shorelines Management Act, which requires all counties and cities with streams, rivers, lakes, or marine shoreline to develop and implement their own Shorelines Master Programs. In the city of Lacey, we primarily have one type of shoreline, that's lakes. We have a very small piece of marine shoreline up at the very north end of the city. We also have a few areas of shoreline just north of Martin Way that are associated with Woodland Creek, but the vast majority of our shorelines are associated with our 5 lakes: Chambers, Hicks, Long, Southwick, and Pattison Lake. And for purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be limiting my discussion of shorelines to those associated with lakes, since that's by and large what we have the most of here in the city of Lacey. So what land areas, or what areas are subject to the Shorelines Master Program and that set of regulations? Well, it's like I said, in dealing with lakes, it's lakes that are 20 acres or larger, and then all the upland areas that extend 200 feet landward from the ordinary high water mark of those lakes, as well as wetlands associated with the lake edge. So when a development project is proposed that falls within that 200 foot area from the ordinary high water mark of the lake, that's when they're required to comply with the city's shoreline regulations. So, in fact, many of you who live on, I'm assuming who in attendance tonight, probably live on one of our lakes, probably on Hicks Lake, and have maybe gone through the shoreline process with us here at the city. So any type of development, whether it's building a new house or garage, adding on to an existing structure, building a dock, tree removal, or other type of significant vegetation, all of those things are required to comply with the shorelines regulations, so long as they are within that 200-foot shorelines jurisdiction area. The most commonly development proposals will only require an exemption, something where planning staff takes a look at it, makes sure that it's consistent with our shorelines management program, and then issues a letter, maybe a month and within like a 30-day period. However, there are certain types of development that will require a higher level of review, such as the 2 projects that are currently in proposal, but we're going to talk about a little bit about tonight on Hicks Lake. And that takes us to the development process. How does a development proposal move through the permitting process at the city of Lacey? So what does that development process look like? Typically, we have 2 main land use processes that we use at the city of Lacey. The first is our administrative review process. Most commonly, we call that site plan review. When a proposed use or when a development proposal comes in that's allowed outright under the zoning code, for example, a Costco in the general commercial district, apartments in high density residential zone, or a bakery, let's say, in a community commercial district. So when a proposal comes in that's allowed under the zoning, that's what we expected. When the Planning Commission went through their process, we anticipated those types of uses in those zones. When a proposal comes in that instance, it goes through the administrative review or site plan review process. And then so long as a proposal meets the minimum requirements of the underlying zone, it goes through that site plan review process. So what does that look like? So we've got a little flow chart here down at the bottom, and that typically a development proposal will start out as maybe a phone call to staff. Maybe let's say a business owner or a landowner calls us and said, "Hey, I've got this idea for a use that I want to try. Is it allowed in this zone? I've got this parcel. I want to do this." And they'll talk to a planner, and one of the planning staff will say, either yes or no. Assuming it is an allowed use, the next thing we do is we tell them that they need to come in for what's called a pre-submission conference. And what that is that it's an opportunity for, like I said, a business owner, developer, property owner to come in and sit down with city staff and talk about, and for us to go through all of the requirements and all the regulations that they're going to encounter on their project if they want to move forward with their development proposal. So it's kind of a way to give the applicant a good idea of going in before they spend a lot of money on a project, whether or not their project is feasible on that site. So after they have that pre-submission process, if the applicant decides, yeah, I think that's feasible, the next step is that they're going to submit their application. And so once that application is submitted, then planning staff, Sarah Reese or I will take that application and we'll route it out to other city departments or some other maybe state agencies for their review and comment. And then after we have received received comments back from the applicable departments or agencies, then we issue a decision letter, either approving or denying the application. So that administrative review process, it's all done at the staff level. It's, like I said, it's a pretty straightforward process, but it starts with the pre-sub and it ends with staff, planning staff issuing a decision letter. The other process that we commonly use is what's known as the quasi-judicial review process. An example of that is the Shoreline Substantial Development Permit, which, again, both projects that we're talking about tonight are required to go through. Another commonly used quasi-judicial review, some of you may have heard of, is the conditional use permit process. Conditional use permit process is used for certain types of uses that, because of their unique characteristics, can't be limited to automatically to one type of zone. Sometimes that's churches or hospitals are a good example. In the case of the projects tonight, again, using that we're talking about tonight, the Shoreline Substantial Development Permit process, that's a mouthful, is a specific type of shoreline permit review that requires additional level of review. Things that are typically exempt might be new single family homes. Like I said, additions to garages, tree removals, all those things are considered exempt. But there are certain things that in certain uses in certain types of shoreline designations, we know that they're going to need a little bit higher review. Maybe they're potentially a little more intense, or they have the potential anyways to have greater impacts. So we want to make sure that, that we take a closer look at those types of uses. And so projects that are required to go through that judicial review have a similar process to the site plan review that we just talked about, that administrative review, in that they first start out with a pre-sub, then they'll submit their application, and then planning staff will route that project out for review. However, this is where the two processes diverge a bit. So once the staff has routed those projects out for review, and then again, once we get all those comments back, instead of issuing a decision letter, staff then puts together a recommendation in the form of a staff report that usually contains a whole bunch of recommended conditions of approval, let's say. And that staff report, as well as all of the supporting documents that we've used to make our decision, including public comments, agency comments, plans and reports that have been submitted by the developer. Staff takes all of that and then sends that to the hearings examiner. At that point, we've scheduled a public hearing and we've set a date, and then the hearings examiner then holds a public hearing at which he will take testimony from both staff, from the applicant and their design professionals, as well as from the public. And that's yet another opportunity that the public has to provide comment, is at the public hearing. And then at the close of the hearing, the hearings examiner will do what we call, they'll close the record, basically. And then all of the items that have been submitted and all the comments that have come in up to that point are then contained in that official record of the hearing. And then at that point, the hearings examiner has 10, I believe, business days to get us his recommendation back. And then the hearings examiner then makes that issues that recommendation, and then that recommendation then goes to the city council for final approval. So as you can see, it is a lengthier process. It's more involved. There's a public hearing. And then again, after that public hearing, then that record is taken to the council and the council makes their final decision. So it's not considered administrative in the sense that staff is not issuing the decision on that. Staff is making a recommendation to the hearings examiner, who then makes a recommendation to the city council for their final approval. So it just provides a little bit higher level of review, more opportunity for public comment and public engagement. So that's the difference between those two. So going back now a little bit to the project review, just to maybe flush out all of the different things that a project is, the types of review that a project gets when it goes through the land use permitting process. Us planners, we're experts in land use regulations, but we are by no means experts in everything that a development proposal has to, is required to, all the different regulations proposals required to meet. And that's when we rely on our subject matter experts. So we route the project out internally to our public works department, who comments on things like water, sewer, stormwater, transportation infrastructure, traffic impacts. We also route it to building and fire, to our police department, to our parks department. So all of those city departments have the opportunity to comment on that, on a development proposal. In addition to that, we also route projects out to outside agencies, like our adjacent jurisdictions, sometimes Thurston County, the City of Olympia, Intercity Transit, certainly the Department of Ecology, especially on shorelines projects. We rely very heavily on their shorelines expertise and their wetlands expertise in reviewing some of the technical aspects of these more complicated reviews. Some projects get routed to the school district, certainly fish and wildlife, to our local tribes, as well as to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. So as you can see, we don't issue these recommendations or decisions in a vacuum. We rely on a lot of different folks who are experts in their fields to help support us in our decision making or in our recommendation making. So for staff review, like I said, city staff is required to review projects for compliance with local regulations. The planning staff is responsible for compliance with various city ordinances as they pertain to land use. So for planning staff, that's typically we review a project to make sure that it complies with our zoning code, with our parking ordinance, with landscape, critical areas. And in the case of the two projects that we're talking about tonight, that's your wetlands and your shorelines. We look at, obviously we have a tree protection ordinance. And then the other things that we look at, most projects will require some sort of design review that takes a look at both site design as well as the design of the buildings themselves. And then I think that one of the other questions that we get asked a lot is, as planning staff, is how can I voice my opinion and do my comments matter? And the answer is yes. But how your comments are used is really going to be impacted by what type of land use decision is under consideration. So earlier in my presentation, I talked a little bit about the legislative process. And that's that process that the comprehensive plan goes through, or a zoning ordinance goes through, or the shorelines management program. Those are all legislative processes. Or sometimes rezones. That's another thing that can be considered a legislative process, meaning it goes through the planning commission and then to the city council for adoption. And it's during this legislative process where honestly, where public comments have the most impact, because that's at the point where we're really trying to set the roadmap and the vision for how we want our community, how we want the community to look. What are those really important values that the public has? And, that's when we really want to get when public comments can have the most impact. As you start to move further down the land use decision ladder, as I think I referred to it, you start getting into more of the permitting of land use decisions. And those permitting decisions have to be that we make, or that the council makes, are based on our ordinances and have very clear regulations that have been established during that legislative process. We went through all the legwork during that legislative process to say, okay, these are the types of things, uses, or these are the types of design standards that we want to apply to these types of uses. And so at the point where we're reviewing permits, we really have to make sure that we are treating applicants fairly, whether that applicant is a business owner who is applying for, to develop a piece of property, or whether that applicant is a homeowner who is wanting to do something on their house or in their yard, or the small business owner who wants to maybe expand their business. We have to ensure that we are treating those applications fairly and consistently, and reviewing those against our regulations that we've adopted. And so public comment, as we start to get down, in the permitting level, it's still very important, and we want to get feedback from the public, because a lot of times, sometimes the public will bring up impacts that projects might have that maybe we're not aware of. And so we need to take a look at those when we're developing the conditions of approval and how we're going to mitigate those impacts. But I think sometimes there's a misconception that that public opinion alone can sway how we make a decision, or how we make a recommendation on a permit or a project. And unfortunately, that's not one of those things that we can necessarily take into consideration. We have to look at actual known impacts and how we're going to mitigate for those impacts. So that's why when we get down into the permitting process, sometimes there's not as much we can do with public comments as there is when we at the higher level of review in the legislative portion of the review process. So, like I said, there's a sort of a sliding scale of how public comments are used and the impact that they can have during the review process. I would point out that the two projects that we're talking about today, Shoreline Substantial Development Permit, sort of lie in this middle area here. They do go to a public hearing. And so there is more opportunity for the public to comment and on the project, and to identify impacts through that comment process and through that hearing process. It's not quite as regimented as, say, our site plan review process, or building permits or whatnot. So we're kind of right in the middle with these two particular projects. And that kind of takes us into the development projects that are before us tonight. As many of you are aware, the most recent Hicks Lake apartment project to be routed is what we're referring to as Project 2181 Schneider Homes, Hicks Lake's apartment. The proposal is to construct a 178 unit, 3-building apartment complex. We've got a north building, a south building, and then a smaller east building. 2 recreational structures, would be these 2 buildings right here. A total of 293 parking stalls, and that includes both surface parking and then underground parking associated with the residential buildings themselves. And then this project is also proposing a pier as well as a floating dock. And then obviously that will require associated site improvements, frontage improvements, utility improvements, and whatnot. And I guess in talking about project specifics, I just want folks to keep in mind that the site plans that we're showing you tonight are preliminary site plans that were just submitted with the application. As Sarah mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, both of these projects are still very early in the review process. The site plans have not been approved. Obviously, the decisions have not been issued, or recommendations have not been issued. Staff is still reviewing projects for compliance with all those regulations I talked about a bit earlier. So So this site plan is kind of the preliminary site plan that first came in. It may not be the final product that's that we see come out of this, but wanted to certainly give folks an idea of what's being proposed. So that being said, I think I will now turn it over to Reese, and he can talk a little bit about Project 2190.
Evening, everyone. So Project 2190, I think everyone here might be a little bit more familiar with. I recognize some of the names here for participants, and I've talked here with you before. So just a quick oversight of the project. It is a 132 unit, 4-building garden style apartments. The max height so far is proposed to be 30 feet. There's 2 buildings that accompany with it, and that's going to be the amenity building on the west or the east face there, and then the recreational building that's proposed closer, which is proposed to be a picnic structure. Associating it is going to be 199 auto stalls, which has been proposed, and the 22 covered bike stalls. The current dock is proposed to be retained, and there's been no mention thus far of it being expanded on or anything of that nature. And of course, with this would come the utility improvements, the shoreline vegetation restoration, and things of that nature that come along with the development. Let's see. We can move to the next slide here. All right. So it's been kind of touched upon thus far throughout this process here on this meeting, but where are we now? So we have it highlighted down below. We're still in the review stages for both of these projects. The reason being, due to the higher scrutiny of the quasi-judicial review, and the reason they're being reviewed or in that quasi-judicial capacity is due to the fact that, as shown in both Sam and I's slides before here, both projects have within that urban conservancy zone, which is the shoreline delineation for this section of Hicks Lake, there's the amenity building within it. And that would be the structures located within that urban conservancy, the shoreline area, but outside of that shoreline area is the zoning high density residential. Both those zones have existed in the city in that area for quite some time now, over 20 years at this point, just for some historical context of the area. But that's the reason that it would be going through this the process that it is. The apartments are essentially required to be only within that high density residential area and not encroach on the urban conservancy, where the development standards for that zone is, I believe, 1 per acre within the shoreline itself. So throughout this process, public notice and parties of record, what does that mean? The initial routings go out for the public record, and they're routed out for 30 days for public comment, where there can be a no action period on any of the materials. There can be no decisions made, nothing of that nature. What happens within that is initially, just as mentioned before, the other agencies, internal city staff, and the public is notified, and we wait for the comment to come back on that. And then what happens once comment is given from the public, generally that person becomes a party of record, which means as anything moves forward for, say, staff recommendation, for a hearing, anything of the public nature to do with this process is then the party of records are notified individually, as opposed to how it would normally be, where it's it goes to the paper, it's posted on site. Now it's directly in the hands of whoever is a party of record, as well as the 2 aforementioned, where it's in the paper and posted on site. So the next stage would be, after review, is staff recommendation, and that would be once the review cycle is complete. Whereas, and I can't speak for the project for Schneider Homes, but for Hicks Lake at the moment, additional materials have been requested. So therefore, the review is kind of, it's stuck in that review limbo, and it won't be staff recommendation until that is taken back in. And that's kind of that function of that initial routing where we ask other agencies, hey, is this the amount of materials you need? Is there more things you need to look for? How can we get you the materials you need for a comprehensive look at a site development here? And so public hearing is going to be the next major step where the public, for parties of record, will be notified to kind of have say within the project and have it be known. Additionally, for parties of record, when that comment is submitted, what happens is the comment itself becomes record, not just the person who is commenting. And so it's something that goes into that kind of staff recommendation packet where the hearings examiner will look at these public comments and see if, say, they've been addressed, if the code applies, or if it's general comment as opposed to grievance or notification of some kind of element that was overlooked or something along those lines. And so they look to see if that ties into the typical review items that we have with our process, which would be here on our next slide. Again, it's kind of been mentioned before, but when it comes to the project specifics, moving forward with these kinds of things, when we're in that review process, what we look for, and I know this is one that I've seen comment on for the Hicks Lake 2190, traffic generation impacts, and that's a big one. So one thing that comes in for that would be a traffic impact analysis, and that's one where at least for 2190. We needed additional materials for something like that. And then that goes to the traffic specialists. They look at that and how that can impact and how things can be mitigated to better withstand some kind of influx of traffic and things along those nature. And that again ties into something along the lines of pedestrian safety. So we look for that when it comes to crossings, internal movement of pedestrians with automobiles and housing, fire safety. All of that kind of goes into the pedestrian safety aspect. The next part of it would be building and site design. And that's something where it kind of ties more into the planning realm and the public works realm. We have the standards within our code for multifamily design. And that's kind of what we look to. And then we also look for site design and how it integrates not only internally, but externally, and that could be all the way down to specifics, kind of when it comes to site design or building design, and say lighting and how that affects close by neighbors, or something about noise, or a big one would be height of buildings. And so we have that built in within our design standards to make sure that height of a building doesn't get too close, and it's right next to a single family home. And so we have things in place that we make sure that these kind of larger developments don't end up overwhelming different uses of close by to that parcel. And then additionally, we look at landscaping. We look at landscaping buffers, screening. We try to maintain we maintain a 5% tree tract in any site over an acre to keep Lacey's tree coverage, as well as something like the Shoreline Master Program within the shoreline developments. Anytime there's some kind of development within an urban conservancy, what that does is, though there may be development to the standards that are within the shoreline to meet intent and follow all design standards, once a development takes place within some kind of zone, improvements need to be made to the entire site. So for these projects, when there's development in that urban conservancy for the amenity buildings per se, what happens is once they get approval or begin construction, they're required to take out any invasive species that are on the shoreline area for that vegetation management and replace it with native species for an ecological restoration aspect. But yeah, with that, Samara, unless there's something else that you want to touch upon, I believe that brings us to the Q&A portion of our presentation here.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Samara, or should we?
I think we can go ahead and take some
Okay.
questions. And I think we could probably, anything that we, wouldn't maybe people want more explanation on, we can definitely flesh out through questions.
Certainly. So we do have a few questions in the chat box. And if you have other, I have 5 here listed and we'll try to go through them. Certainly if anybody else out there has some questions, please bring them on because we do have some time here this evening. The first question is, when will public comments be taken on these projects? And how did we come to the decision not to require an EIS on these 2 projects? Sammer, do you want to address
Absolutely.
that? Okay.
Sure. So first off, on terms of public comment, well, we're taking public comment now. So, you know, you can absolutely submit comments on either project to Reese or myself. And I had our email addresses up there just a moment ago, but I'll make sure we put those up before we end tonight so that folks can get those. But yeah, you can absolutely submit comments now. And one thing I just wanted to, Reese did a good job explaining, and I just want to reiterate again, is with shoreline substantial development permits, there is a 30-day, it's often called a comment period, but as Reese said, it's really a no action period, meaning the jurisdiction will not take, cannot take any action before that 30 days. That being said, we will continue to take comments up until the hearing basically. And then once at the hearing, you can always submit comments in person you can, certainly the public can attend the hearing and can submit comments to the hearings examiner directly. So just because we get past that 30 days, it doesn't mean that, you know, you can no longer submit comments. We'll definitely be taking comments all the way through that. So, so we're taking comments now, and we'll make sure that you get our contact information so you can do that if you do not already have that. As to your second question as to why there was not an EIS required. So as some of you may be aware, the state of Washington has a policy, the State Environmental Policy Act, and it's through this that we used it to, you know, mitigate project impacts in some ways. And so environmental impact statements were a tool that was, I think, largely used, you know, for when much more when SEPA was first adopted, you know, what is it, 30 some years ago now. And the way that most jurisdictions use environmental impacts today is that they're done when you adopt things like your comprehensive plan, or maybe sometimes a sub area plan, but they're used on large scale sort of planning, you know, planning projects, I guess you can say, maybe not development projects, but planning projects when you're really assessing the environmental impact of, say, when, you know, a city is incorporating for the first time, or when you're annexing in you know, or maybe you have a development project that is beyond the scope of what was originally envisioned under the environmental impact statement that was done when, you know, the city was annexed. Today, for most of our projects, we use SEPA through the environmental checklist process. One of the things that the city of Lacey has had for years is a very actually robust set of local ordinances that address things like the city of Lacey has its own wetland ordinance. We have a tree and vegetation protection ordinance. We've got, you know, we have a shorelines master program. We have ways of addressing traffic impacts. We have all of those things contained within our ordinances that we can use those ordinances to address those impacts. So we don't necessarily need an environmental impact statement to do those things. And so we don't necessarily, so environmental impact statements, you know, was prepared when we, like I said, when the city first adopted its zoning code, or when we adopted our first comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plans and the environmental impact statement that was prepared at that time took a look at all of the expected impacts that you would have as you convert areas to urban growth. And we identified those impacts at that time. And so as individual development projects come through, so long as the impacts that those projects are having aren't greater than or beyond the scope of what was originally expected, with those, with the comp plan, let's say, then those types of things can be mitigated through our local ordinances. Do you have anything to add to that, Sarah?
I don't think so. I think you did a good job of mentioning. So yeah, environmental impacts are generally regulated through our other critical areas ordinances, and SEPA is in place and available to us to mitigate things that our ordinances don't cover, things like traffic impacts to county road projects, which is what we would use SEPA for other projects. The next question is, when was the zoning changed from R1 to R3 on these parcels? And unless Samra has any other knowledge, these parcels have been zoned high density residential, and the shoreline designation, that's the double zone of shoreline within the 200 feet of the shoreline zone for probably at least the last 20 years. R1 and R3 sound to me like Thurston County, old county zoning designations. So potentially those would have changed when the area was annexed into the city. So as long as they've been within the city, they've likely been zoned that higher density residential. Do you know anything different, Samra?
I do not. I was just going to, I made that sound, that is my understanding as well. I was going to look and see here on my GIS. So this area was, this part of Lacey was originally, and was part of the original part, part of Lacey. So back in 1967. And so I suspect that I think the zoning probably went into the modern day zoning, what we know as high density residential, probably occurred when we adopted our first zoning ordinance under the Growth Management Act. So that would have been back in 1992.
Yep, that sounds right.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact zoning definition would have been prior to that. And, it probably was something more general, like low density or something residential, but it's probably in 1992 would be my guess when we adopted it. Like I said, our first state mandated Growth Management Act zoning ordinance is when that would have changed to high density.
Okay.
One thing I probably should add is just the intent for having a high density zone on the lakes. As long as I've been at the city, I know there have been discussions about wanting to provide a variety of housing types along the lake. One of our housing goals and policies throughout the city is to provide a variety of housing types. So not just, for a long time, I'm sure some of you who've lived here for a long time are aware, Lacey, was largely anyways, a single family community. And, one of the goals was to increase affordability and to provide more options for folks at different price points in the market or for different demographics, is to provide a variety of housing types. And so, wanting to provide different housing types with different opportunities, such as like waterfront property or shoreline property, has been a long time goal of the city council, and to try to provide a diversity of housing types.
Okay. The next question, what do you consider environmentally sensitive, if not these properties on Hicks Lake and clearing of the wooded areas? Generally speaking, environmentally sensitive properties include things like wetlands, critical habitat for different types of endangered species, and part of any land use review is determining whether or not there are environmentally sensitive areas on the site. If Samra or Reese want to speak any more specifically to these parcels, they can do so. But there are two, or they each are within the shoreline zone of Hicks Lake, so within 200 feet of the ordinary high water mark. There's the urban conservancy zone, but unless they were to have other wetlands associated with them, and they may have lake edge wetlands, and Sam or Reese can speak to those, but those are the areas that would be considered environmentally sensitive on these parcels. And I won't speak too much to that. I can let Reese and Samara, who know the properties better than I do, speak additionally to that.
Can you see my zoning map?
Yes.
Okay, good. Wasn't sure if I shared the right screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to show again. So the two parcels in question are this parcel right here, and then this parcel right here. And the what this is a parcel area map, obviously with an overlay of the city's zoning map. And so in terms of critical areas on these parcels, shorelines is considered to be a critical area. And as I kind of explained earlier in the presentation, what's considered shorelines jurisdiction is, well, obviously the lake itself, but then any land area that is 200 feet landward of the ordinary high water mark. And so bear in mind that this map that I'm showing you is not a surveyed down to the details map. It's just, it's showing generally, because when we established the shoreline areas and even our zoning areas, we didn't go out and survey every single property, but we wanted to give folks a conceptual idea of where those areas were. So in terms of these properties, where what the sensitive areas on these sites are going to be considered this 200-foot area landward of the ordinary high water mark on both properties. That's the shorelines jurisdiction. Everything that is outside of the shorelines jurisdiction is subject to just the underlying zoning, which in this case is high density residential. I believe on my on the project I'm working on, and I think on Reese's too, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but there is also a lake edge wetland that will that we'll be taking a look at as well. So in addition to our shoreline regulations, we will also be taking a look at the wetland ordinance of our zone of our municipal code and our critical areas ordinance. So those are the two types of critical areas that at this point anyways, again, we're still in the review process, but those are the two types of critical areas that I anticipate having to consider in review of these projects.
Okay. The next question, what is the process to get these properties rezoned?
Well, the rezoning process, that's the rezone process is my understanding. This is a long range process. So you're talking to 3 current planners, but that being said, rezoning, which is also, so rezoning and comprehensive plan amendments are kind of go together hand in hand, because in order to rezone a property, you also have to amend the zoning map, which essentially rezones our comprehensive plan. And the rezone process and comprehensive plan amendment process is something that happens once a year. There are 2 types of rezones, is my understanding, Sarah. There's a city originated, and then there's an applicant originated. And that has to go before the planning commission. And then, like I talked about earlier, it goes through the legislative process. So it's something that you work with the planning commission on, and then you go to the city council. It's usually, and then usually when, not usually, always, when they're an applicant driven process, you're talking about something that's landowner initiated. So, that would involve obviously the landowner in trying to go through that process. So, and then there has to be, we have to come up with reason. The planning commission, as well as the council, has to, have sound policy reasons why a property would need to be rezoned. But that is a legislative process that happens once a year through our planning commission.
Right, and as an applicant, like Samara said, as a applicant initiated, it would need to have the property owner would need to be the one to initiate that application process, and be willing to look at different types of rezones on that property or different types of uses.
Mhm.
Okay, this is a little bit project specific, but I think that we can probably answer, Samara or Reese may know the answer to this. When the site plans say access to the public, what does that mean? Does that mean open access to the public, or does that mean just for residents of the apartments? Do you guys have any information into what they're proposing at this point?
You know, I actually don't have,
Okay.
I can't actually answer that at this point.
Okay.
I don't know if Reese does on his project, but
No, I'm looking, I don't see access to the public. And I'm down by, I don't see it anywhere within the initial site plan. As far as I'm aware, that comes down to something that's up to the developer. That's not something we speak to.
well, public access to shorelines is definitely a, you know, one of the main emphases of the State Shoreline Management Act, and therefore our shorelines management program. But that being said, you know, I just can't answer that question at this point, just because it still is in the review process, and it's, you know, it's a complicated site. There's a lot of stuff going on. It just isn't something that one of the areas that I've gotten to in the review yet. But but I do also want to say that if you did receive notice on this as an email, or if you contact me, I can send you a link to the project information, and that is all available for the public to review. So you can review it right along with me.
Okay, thank you. Next question, who does and then who pays for the traffic impact studies? So traffic impact studies are required for any project that generates 50 trips in the PM peak hour. Both of these projects, I'm sure, were required to submit a traffic impact analysis. The city requires that the developer contract with a traffic engineer who can create such a study. So the developer hires an engineer and they pay for that traffic study. Let's see, what type of renters will be covered? Are people of low income included as renters because they need housing? Do you have any idea if there's any sort of housing for low income housing?
In the SEPA for my project, it's been listed for, they're stating that it would be moderate income is what's planned, but.
Okay.
Yeah, I would anticipate that both projects are what we call market rate housing. I haven't heard anything about, you know, low income housing per se. Okay.
After recommendations have been made, what avenues exist for appeal by both citizens and developers? So for quasi-judicial reviews like this, once the council has made its final decision, there's a 21-day appeal period to Superior Court. So that is, although Samara is looking like she wants to say something about the Shoreline Master Program, the Shoreline Management Act.
Substantial development permits too, they are appealed to the
Shoreline Hearing Board.
Shoreline Hearing Board. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And within 21 days?
The Department of Ecology.
And is that within 21 days?
I believe it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You've said the high density residential designation is now over 20 years old. Many of us were not here that long ago. Is that something that can be revisited? So zoning designations and revisiting those zoning designations, those are all typically things that take place during comp plan updates and comp plan amendments. So Samara talked a lot about, in the beginning of her presentation, about getting involved when comprehensive plans are developed and updated. And that's really the time to talk about zoning designations and what may or may not be appropriate for certain areas. Samara or Reese, did you have anything you wanted to add to that answer? Or?
No, I think that's generally a pretty accurate statement. Yeah.
Okay. When are the 30 days over? I think, Reese, your initial 30 days have expired, haven't they?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean again, that's the no action period. That's not the end of the comment period. So Reese and Samra both are continuing to take comments on this, on the applications all the way up until the day of the public hearing.
Yep. Correct.
Let's see. Stalls for over 500 cars, underground parking on a wetland and within a 100-year floodplain. How will that affect the surrounding dwellings, water displacement? That's pretty project specific. Both the projects will be reviewed for impacts to critical areas. If they were in a 100-year floodplain, they would have to address 100-year floodplain regulations. But those are things that would all be looked at in the project during project review. When was the zoning established? I think when was zoning established? Is it consistent with current standards, and why is only the high density zoning outside of the Lacey Court area? We've talked about when we think the zoning was established, probably back in 1992 for these parcels. And it is, we've had a couple different comp plan amendments since then, and the zoning designation has remained high density residential for these parcels to encourage development of alternative types of housing. Samra touched on that a little bit. And actually outside that, there's several high density residential zones there throughout the city, especially on these larger parcels. And especially when we're trying to talk about infill housing to meet our requirements under the Growth Management Act, high density zoning designations allow for alternative types of housing. So these parcels are not the only ones outside of the Lacey Court area that are zoned high density residential. They're scattered all throughout the city with the intent to provide alternative types of housing.
And just to touch upon that, some of our zones, when it comes to, they may be oriented for a specific way with uses, but for some of our zones, when it comes to how they do residential capacity, it'll generally refer to, if residential is developed within this type of zone, which may not be named high density, refer to the high density standards. So it may not be always apparent which zones have that high density that are outside the core, like a mixed use high density corridor, for example, which is kind of a mixed use building and high density, which is outside of our core.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Samra? No. Okay. Are buildings situated to allow solar panels to be applied to buildings and semi-permeable surfaces to prevent runoff from parking?
Well, again, that kind of gets into project level review. But, you know, one of the things I will say generally about our stormwater design manual, for example, is our current City of Lacey's stormwater design manual does require developments to use what's known as, commonly referred to as low impact development techniques. One of those common techniques we see developers use are bioswales or rain gardens, which you may have heard of, and then permeable paving options. So as well as like some things they call modular wetlands, you know, so those types of techniques are required under our stormwater design manual in order to in order to use something other than that, a more standard type of or not standard, I should say, but older types of stormwater management, you have to show that physically it is unfeasible on your site to do that. So both projects will be required, have prepared stormwater reports on this project, and will be reviewed for compliance with that. And they'll have to prioritize using those low impact development techniques in their design.
That was a good answer, especially to the next question, Samra, which is the map you showed had lots of roof and roads and parking, all non-permeable. What happens to the runoff from storms? So I think Samra just answered that question. They're going to have to address their stormwater through different types of techniques, low impact development techniques, and they're required to retain their stormwater on site.
Correct. Yep. All new development is required to keep their stormwater on site.
Let's see, the next question. When will surveys, traffic and environmental take place? Can we participate to know more about the process and what is considered? And what year was the parcel zoned? I think we've answered the zoned question. The traffic and environmental studies would have been a requirement of a complete application. So those processes are already done. Samara mentioned that she can provide a link to all the documents. If you wanted to take a look at those, just send her an email, Reese as well, and they can provide you information or provide you links to those documents.
For the Hicks Lake multifamily on the south there, the 2190, that's one where a stop clock was issued to the development so that a TIA could be submitted.
Okay.
Just so everyone's aware of the difference between the two projects right now.
Okay. Next question, will the projects be subject to the Shoreline Management Act adopted by the state legislature? The answer to that is yes. That's why they've submitted shoreline substantial development permit applications and why they are going through the quasi-judicial review process at the city. Our shoreline master program that we've adopted has been reviewed and is in compliance with the Shoreline Management Act that was adopted by the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
Has the city issued a determination of non-significance on these projects? If so, when did that happen? I believe that has not happened at this point.
That has not happened yet.
Right.
No. Yeah. Yeah. So anybody who is a party of record or who becomes a party of record before that's issued will get a copy of that determination and notice that it has been when it has been issued. So.
Let's see, expand on the public hearing process. What ways can public input to the hearings examiner? Public can either attend the hearing, and they will probably be Zoom. If you want to make sure that you get a notice, a hearing notice, make sure to contact one of the planners to get on the list so that you get a hearing notice. Also, if you live near the project within 300 feet, you'll get a notice mailed to you. If you're a property owner, if you live near the project and you notice a sign, I would stop and look at the sign and then contact the city of Lacey for information on how to attend the hearing. And then you can always submit written comments to the planner, and those will be included in your project record or in the project record. Urban density should include density of birds and animals. This is, currently there are many birds and animals, high density for them. What will happen to them?
So one of the, gosh, where my words are failing me. One of, I think, the natural consequences of urban development, is displacement of trees, of wildlife. And that's one of those things that, when we first adopt, like I said, a comprehensive plan or a zoning ordinance that, we anticipate when we, when we're looking at the impacts of adopting a zoning ordinance or a comprehensive plan, is I think as planners and as city officials understand that those are some of the unfortunate and less pleasant trade-offs between urban development and wildlife or trees. But part of the reason we have the Growth Management Act, and part of the reason we have the plans and the regulations that we adopt is to try to focus our growth within the urban areas and within city limits and within our urban growth areas. We want to try to preserve one of the main goals of the Growth Management Act was to try to preserve our rural lands. And so while we certainly do want to, when we have things like recognize that we've got maybe threatened species on sites or whatnot, we definitely have regulations that address, having to do that. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Mazama pocket gopher that we see has become a much bigger issue in the county or in Tumwater. There are certainly regulations that we have that have to protect those types of things. And as I think Reese mentioned, the city of Lacey does have tree retention requirements, tree tracks requirements, as well as tree retention in the shoreline areas. So, we do have regulations that address those things, but we also do have to recognize that urban development, one of those trade-offs for urban development, so that we can preserve our rural lands, is that there is going to be some displacement. That's just an unfortunate but impact of this type of development.
Okay, next I'm going to address a couple questions about notice, and I'm not sure if I have one question. When did you mail residents in this area about this? I only learned about this 5 days ago. I'm on Maxine Street. I don't know if that's about notice of application or notice of this meeting. Notice of this meeting, how did notice of this meeting go out?
It was sent to parties of record.
Okay, so people who already commented.
Yeah, on social media sites.
Yep.
Okay, and so if you're talking about notice of the projects, so when the notice of applications are issued, they are issued to the paper and then posted on site. Hearing notices, and this is an informational session, it's not a public hearing. Hearing notices are sent 10 days prior to the public hearing. So a hearing notice on on either of these projects have not been mailed yet because there has been no hearing scheduled. If you want to make sure that you receive a hearing notice or future documents, make sure to contact Samra or Reese and get on their mailing list.
I believe for this process, since it's shoreline, it's 15 days before for the hearing examiner.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would have the part.
Let's see. A better job of informing citizens. Many do not get the paper. Many landowners know nothing about this, even though they live on Hicks Lake Road. And I think that the city, some of these processes, these sessions are ways that we're trying to get out and inform the citizens to do a better job of actually informing the citizens. We do have statutory notice requirements that are done at a couple different points during project review for quasi-judicial projects. Are at notice of application, and that sites are posted on site when the application is received and posted in the paper. And then projects with property owners within 300 feet receive a hearing notice when the hearing is scheduled. And again, the property would be posted on site. Fortunately, for projects like this, word of mouth is very strong, is an excellent way that people find out about things. That's how probably many of you are here tonight, is word of mouth, because somebody saw the notice of application and passed on that information to the adjacent residents. Can you guys explain the optional DNS process, and does it apply to both of these proposals? It does apply to both of these proposals. And the optional DNS process is one that we use when SEPA is required. And what that essentially does is it combines the notice of application, the land use application. So we've received a site plan review or a conditional use permit application, and a SEPA determination or a SEPA checklist is required. And so rather than having two different notice, both of those applications require some type of process. What the state Regulatory Review Act allows is for those processes to be combined into one process. So we don't have long comment periods and long decision periods for applications that can be combined into one concurrent review. And yes, it applies to both of these processes. So there's a couple questions about Wanchers Park and expanding it with these parcels. I don't believe that the city has, I can't answer that question. That's a question really for our Parks Director, whether or not they ever considered expanding these Wanchers Park into these parcels. These are privately owned parcels, and
And
I
just
can't, yeah,
And just
sorry,
to
go ahead.
reiterate, the project to the north anyways, given its proximity to Wanchers was routed to our Parks Department for review and comment. So
Okay.
they will certainly have opportunity to comment on the proposal.
So there's a question about additional cars, 500 additional cars on Hicks Lake Road. So the discussion about traffic impacts is going to happen. It's pretty specific to the projects that will happen in staff reports. They both were required to address traffic impacts through traffic impact analyses. And as staff gets into those reviews, and our transportation department reviews those documents, appropriate mitigation will be applied to the project.
And just as a reminder too, once staff has completed its review, we do put together a staff report, and part of that staff report, in addition to conditions of approval that contain mitigation, will also have an analysis section. So, that will also, copy of the staff report does go out to parties of record as well. So that'll be an opportunity to kind of review that prior to the hearing and to see sort of what specifically was analyzed out of the TIA and what sort of mitigation is proposed to be applied. So.
Can a majority of landowners apply to rezone an area? I think that if they, again, rezoning is a legislative review process, and rezones are best done during comp plan amendment processes, especially for large areas. Owners of the property name and addresses, that's on the application information. And if you would like to review the application information, again, send Samra or Reese an email, and then they can send you links to that project information.
And you know what, I was just thinking, Reese, what we could do is I think we could probably, now that we have our website up and running for
I was thinking that earlier as well.
We can, we just recently got a website up for posting land use application materials to our website. So the Schneider Homes project is currently on there, but we'll make sure that by the end of the week that we get the Gateway Hicks Lake project posted there as well. So that information is easily accessible to folks as well.
We have a question about tree regulations. Why is it that residents can only elect to remove 5 trees every 3 years, but these projects would require clear cut of hundreds of trees? So the city of Lacey does have tree requirements. Developing projects are allowed to remove trees. They do have to retain a certain number of trees. Tree tract requirements apply to these projects. And minimum tree per lot thresholds apply to these projects, just like they do for single family homeowners. Are there any other high density residential designations on any other lakes? I'm not sure that there were, I'm not sure.
No, I think
No.
this is, most of our other lakes are
developed.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. This has some large parcels that were available for development.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There are a couple questions here. Those links are 2 years old. I'm not sure what that, I'm not sure what that comment question is referring to. It says those links are 2 years old. I don't understand that. And then does the displacement of wildlife include bald eagles? We have a critical areas ordinance, chapter 1433, that addresses wildlife, priority species for the state. And bald eagles would be included in that. Are open space designations also subject to change during current planning process? What is the next comprehensive planning period to be held? I think the next comp plan update is in 2025. Is that right?
That
I
sounds
think
right.
that
Yeah, I
sounds
think
right.
that's
Yes.
right. Yeah.
Open space designations typically are on our zoning maps, typically refer to wetlands, parks. Some of the green zones that are considered open space institutional are actually churches. I guess that they could potentially be subject to change during comprehensive planning, but if we have wetland studies and reports on certain wetlands, they probably wouldn't be changed during comprehensive planning. And parks are going to remain open spaces as well on the zoning map. Let's see. Will review commentary by other city departments and other agencies be made to the public? Yes, that's all public record and can be reviewed.
And that will be part of the record and the list of exhibits that goes out as an attachment to the staff report when the hearing is scheduled. So that will all be sent to you if you're a party of record. You'll get a copy of all of that.
Let's see. Is it not a conflict of interest for the developer to pay for a traffic study? I don't think so. The city transportation staff review traffic studies to make sure they meet our traffic comprehensive plan and our requirements in our traffic mitigation ordinances. But the city doesn't want to pay for a traffic study, and I don't think the taxpayers necessarily want to pay for a traffic study. So it's one of the developer's responsibilities to pay for that study. And then the city reviews it. The study is actually done, the traffic impact studies go through a couple different processes. A developer submits what's called a traffic generation worksheet. It's run through some software to determine the number of trips that are developed, and then they work with city staff to determine what needs to be reviewed in that process. The traffic engineer generates the traffic study. City staff reviews it to make sure that they've addressed the impacts in that study and then apply appropriate mitigation. What happens if the proposed land has been a prior native burial site? So the State Department of Historic Preservation and Archaeology reviews these, and if we have evidence of a burial site, then that's addressed during the application review. Also, there's inadvertent findings, requirements that apply to projects if something is discovered, inadvertent discovery. If there's items discovered, whether that's remains or whether that's artifacts from Native American communities on the site, then those projects would be stopped and it would be addressed.
And yeah, and typically it isn't uncommon. Again, I don't want to can't get into project specifics, but typically along lakes, it's very common for both the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, as well as the tribes, to request a cultural resource survey to be done. So prior to any ground disturbing activities, they have to hire a professional archaeologist to go in and do a survey of the site. That's pretty common, and I would anticipate that with these projects. So,
okay. So I think we're getting to about time. I've tried to get to all the questions. There were quite a number of them. But before we go, we'll make sure to get to next steps on these projects. Samara, your Hicks Lake project, do you have a slide? Do you have a slide on that, or talking about next? Do you want me to talk about next steps? Or
yeah. So, well, yeah. Just so next steps. Like I said, Reese and I are both in the still in the review process. The review clock, as Reese indicated, is stopped on that project, on the Gateway Hicks Lake project, meaning we're awaiting more information from the developer prior to restarting the review. And then the Schneider Homes project is about a month and a half-ish behind that in terms of review. So the clock just started on that. So next steps, like I said, we're still taking comment, and I wanted to put both mine and Reese's email address up on the screen. So copy that down. If you don't already have our addresses or have not submitted comment, please do so. And if you need, if you want to submit comment, or if you would like us to send you a link to where you can find all that information that we talked about, traffic studies, stormwater, site plans, all that kind of stuff, please feel free to, and we encourage you to reach out to us and request that information. We'll be happy to get it to you. So, so the next step really is just to continue with the review process. And we will, like I said, once we have received all the necessary comments, we'll be scheduling a hearing. And if you are a party of record, you'll receive notice of that. So I do encourage you to drop us an email and share our email address with anyone who couldn't attend tonight, or maybe doesn't have access to this webinar. So yeah, I would appreciate everyone's attendance tonight.
Samara, you mentioned that the link will be on the website, and we'll send it out to everybody who attended. And hopefully you were able to get some answers to some questions tonight, as well as some understanding of the planning review process that staff undertakes when we're looking at these types of applications. And stay tuned for hearing notices, and get in touch with us if you need or would like additional information. Thanks everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks everyone.